Hey everybody, this is Eric Herrenkohl. I'm here with my colleague Milton Corsey. I lead the executive coaching practice at Achieve Next. I'll let Milton introduce himself, but we're recording this on a Tuesday morning. Yesterday morning, Milton and I came in the office. We were talking after the NFL playoffs and some phenomenal games. And we just got talking about the games and some of the things that happened and didn't happen. And then we realized that out of that conversation, there were some principles emerging that applied directly to the work that we do with senior leaders and with emerging leaders. So we wanted to continue that conversation with you. So with no further ado, I want to turn this over to my colleague, Milton Corsey. Milt, great to see you this morning. I appreciate you taking a couple minutes to talk.
Absolutely, Eric. Always a pleasure. Hello, everybody. Great to meet you all. Like Eric said, yesterday in the office, we had this really interesting conversation, about the playoffs games. We're both Eagles fans. Go Birds! So they won. That's a big plus. But we were really having a conversation about the game between the Buffalo Bills and the Baltimore Ravens, and really the end of that game, and kind of how tragic it was when the tight end for Baltimore ended up dropping the pass. And in that conversation, part of what came up, and just for everybody's edification, I played football in college. So we were talking about those moments and my kind of experience playing the game. And one of the things I mentioned to Eric is that I felt horrible for that tight end. It was just I can't imagine what he's going through today after he dropped that ball and in his mind let everybody down. And one of the things I shared with him is in those moments, I always preferred having the being tightly covered where I could not let my mind wander. I had to focus really specifically on the task at hand. And it was a much greater chance of success then than if I'm all alone and I could get in my way. Like, thoughts would get in my head. What happens if I drop this pass? What happens if I step out of bounds? All of these things would pop into my head, right? Because I had time to think about it. And these are things that happen to everybody who's ever played a game. If you've ever picked up a golf club and you need to chip it close, or hey, if I make this par, I'll shoot my best score. What invariably happens, right? We have all these demons in our head, and we end up screwing up in that moment, right? So part of what we're trying to have a conversation about today is how can we avoid that, keep our thoughts silent, and do what we know we can do in the moment. So,
Yeah, it's I really enjoyed the conversation. And then Milton, what you and I were talking about yesterday and continuing today, as you said, anybody who's picked up a golf club, anybody who played high school sports of any kind, or even plays pickleball on the weekend knows we got to get out of our own heads. If you're thinking, you're losing. In sports, you know that. But you don't hear that anywhere near as much in business. And I just thought that was interesting because human beings are human beings. I think if it applies on the weekends when we're playing games, it applies during the week when we are leading and managing businesses and doing the things that we do. So, I lead the executive coaching practice here. You lead our emerging leaders practice
mhm.
at Next. So then we got talking a little bit about how does this apply in business? So if you don't mind, talk a little bit about how that principle of getting out of our own heads applies when you're working with emerging leaders, for example.
Absolutely, my pleasure, Eric. Yeah, one of the things that we talked about is the idea of how do we get out of our own way, right? And one of the ways that we get out of our own way in any endeavor is through repetition, right? If we do this thing over and over and over and over again, then it becomes second nature. It just becomes what we do, whether it be in a game, in a competition, or in business. So what we try to do with emerging leaders is we try to give them a skill set, right? It's like if you first learn how to play golf, there's the basics. It's the grip on the club. It's the what does the swing look like? It's the timing. It's the weight transfer. All of those things. Well, in training emerging leaders, we tend to try to build that same framework. Like, what are the skills that you need, right? Because typically we get promoted to a leadership position because we're really good at a thing, but that's fundamentally different than leading other people in making sure that thing happens, right? So we're going to give you that skill set to coin one of your phrases. We're going to open up that toolbox and say, what are the things that need to be on that top shelf?
Right. Yeah. Big time. And even as we're talking here, Just that analogy for emerging leaders of moving from being the individual contributor and typically a rock star if you're going to get promoted. It's a
Mhm.
completely different sport. You're playing a completely different sport. And then to your point is, and I think again we can all totally relate to this, the repetition of these new skills is what we need to do in order to make the pivot and to be able to move into that leadership role.
Mhm.
So maybe just give us one example. I think you and I were talking about micromanagement, for example. So if I'm an emerging leader, how do I practice, or what's a habit, or what are the habits that I can practice that are going to help me to get out of micromanagement and into the right kind of posture with my people?
Right. I'm going to share with you kind of a phrasing or framework that the former coach of the Philadelphia Eagles used to preach all the time at his press conferences. Now the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs, Andy Reid, and he would always talk about his job was to make sure his players were in a position to be successful.
Mm,
Right. So as a leader, as an emerging leader, I kind of implore you to adopt that mindset. Right. How do I put the people who are on my team in the best position to be successful?
mm,
And one of the fundamental skills I think that is central to that is this idea of emotional intelligence, being aware situationally of what it is. What does Eric do really, really well? What are his challenges? And then how can I build a framework for Eric, or actually not for, but with Eric? It's important that he's engaged in this thing fully, right? How do I build a framework with Eric that is going to build on his capabilities
mm.
and put him in a position to be successful, right? That's the goal. So as the leader, what is it that Eric does exceptionally well, and how can we use that to make not only him successful but the team successful? And as a leader, I think that that's one of the fundamental things that all of us need to be focusing in on when it talks about growing or improving the performance of our teams.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'm glad you and I started this conversation yesterday. I'm glad we're getting to continue it today. And I really appreciate you making this point because even again, as we're talking here, this idea of it's a completely different sport. And when we, as senior executives, for example, have somebody who is an emerging leader, we got if we remind them, if we help them to gain awareness, hey, this is a whole different game that you're getting ready to play in a leadership
Mhm.
role, and that helps them to slow down and it helps them to focus. And to your point, it helps them to have the patience to develop the habits that they really need to do to lead and to win. So great to see you this morning, Milton. I appreciate you joining me.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Looking forward to the next conversation.
You got it. Take care.